Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Hi, welcome back to Neuroverse. So today we're joined with Elodie Freymann to discuss the evolution of self-medication in chimpanzees. Elodie is a New York-born, London-based freelance natural history storyteller who recently completed a PhD in evolutionary anthropology at the University of Oxford, where she researched how chimpanzees self-medicate with medicinal plants by following two communities of wild chimpanzees in Uganda's Budongo Forest and combining pharmacological testing of collected plants and conducting ethnomedicinal interviews with local traditional healers. Elodie has also documented her research to communicate her science and spread conservation awareness through filmmaking with two upcoming films in progress and other artistic mediums like paper cutting, photography, and illustration. Thank you so much for joining us today, Elodie.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why don't we start by telling us a bit about your scientific journey and what led you to self-medication in chimpanzees?
Yeah. Well, my pathway has been a little bit unusual. I didn't necessarily think I was going to go into science. I have two artistic parents that were in the arts, and I always have been sort of drawn toward visual arts, and I kind of assumed that was going to be my pathway. So I'd always had, as a young kid, this obsession with chimpanzees. I should backtrack. I had this obsession with chimpanzees and primates generally since I was as long as I can remember. And then I also, around the time I was maybe 10, I discovered medicinal plants. And I started learning about botany and how people use medicinal plants all around the world. And I remember I was at a farm museum in upstate New York, and it was this town decked out as if it were in the 1800s, and there was an apothecary, and I just couldn't leave. I was so obsessed with all the cabinets of dried herbs, and I talked to the guy behind the counter, and he was telling me all about the medicinal properties of plants, and I was completely hooked. So I was obsessed with these two very different, disparate topics, and I didn't really think that they came together in any sort of, semblance of a cohesive discipline. So I got to college and I thought, okay, actually at that point I wanted to major in creative writing, which I took a few classes and I was like, you know what, I don't need to do this for a college degree. So I went to a university where I didn't have to choose until the end of my university career what I wanted to major in. So I just took everything I could in botany and animal behavior and art as well. And I kind of had this very motley, class course selection. And I really didn't know what to pick for my major. And then toward the end of college, I took my first anthropology class. And I was like, whoa, now I have a totally third disparate interest that doesn't make sense cohesively. So I just took a bunch of anthropology classes. And as I took these anthro classes, I realized that I could study ethnobotany and the study of the culture of self-medication and traditional botanical knowledge. And so I kind of got to scratch that botanical itch, but I didn't really understand still how I could study chimps using anthropology. So long story short, I finished college with an anthropology degree, and I'd gotten really interested also in ethnographic filmmaking. So kind of, these anthropological films. So I thought, okay, I want to go into, the arts. Maybe I'll go into documentary making. Mm-hmm. So I got a job at this wonderful documentary production company in New York City. But there was, I still just felt this itch that I still hadn't really studied my first true love, chimpanzees. So I Googled masters in chimpanzees, and I wanted to go out of the country because I hadn't taken any. I had gone on, some field work in different places, but I hadn't lived outside of the country. So I was looking at international primatology degrees, and I found a master's that was 9 months at Oxford in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, and there was just one unit on primates. It was not a primatology degree; it was a cognitive and evolutionary anthropology degree. But I got there. I absolutely loved that course, and right before I arrived, sort of, in 2019, I started hearing about this new field called zoopharmacognosy. And zoopharmacognosy is the study of how animals self-medicate with medicinal plants. And it was everything. It was botany, it was chimps, it was anthropology. And so when I, applied for this master's program, I applied with this idea that I would study the cognitive and evolutionary origins of non-human animal self-medication. So that's what I did. So I went and I did this degree and I absolutely loved it. And then the pandemic happened and I wasn't able to do any sort of field work. Obviously, it was also only a 9-month degree. But I wrote this research proposal of how, if I got a PhD and if I got the funding and if I could go to the field and got a field site, how would I study how chimpanzees self-medicate in the wild? And that is how I ended up doing my fieldwork and my PhD. And I finished up in January, and that is how I got there.
Incredible.
Yeah, I really like that journey.
Yeah.
And I think it just speaks to the interdisciplinariness of anthropology and also like how niche the different subtopics can get. And I think we can both kind of relate in that like we both ended up in neuroscience because we wanted something also like interdisciplinary, and it was kind of a good way to combine my different interests. But yeah, and also one of my first loves was also not chimpanzees, but orangutans. And I always wanted to study primates, but ended up not. But it's great to see people like you who did end up pursuing that passion. So
it's never too late. I think that is the thing. That was my takeaway of my sort of academic journey was after I finished, my anthropology degree in university, I thought I had kind of missed the boat to go back and study primates and study animals in the wild. Mm-hmm. And especially after I, got into the film industry, I was like, it's over for me. There's no way. I hadn't taken an undergrad. I think I'd taken one evolutionary biology class. I took invertebrate zoology. I really didn't take any bio. I didn't take any math. I didn't take any statistics. I really had not. I had gone down a very humanities path and social science path, I guess. And so, yeah, I guess for me, that was the shocking thing that it's never too late. You can switch gears and go back and study animals and no one can stop you.
Nice. Yeah, I absolutely love your journey and I'm glad that you managed to get where you always dreamed to be in the end.
Thank you.
And I had never heard of self-medication in primates before I met you. So can you tell us about what sort of self-medicating behaviors chimpanzees exhibit?
Yeah, good question. So there are two very well-established chimpanzee self-medicated behaviors. And when I say well-established, I mean there have been many self-medicated behaviors that have been proposed for chimpanzees over the years. But by established, I mean they've been systematically investigated. There's many sort of cases of observations of this behavior, and there's a lot of evidence. And I can talk more about what evidence you need to establish a self-medicated behavior, because that's a really interesting kind of other topic. But yeah, very well-studied behaviors. The first is called leaf swallowing. And leaf swallowing is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's swallowing leaves whole. And this looks really different than the way a chimpanzee would eat a leaf. So it's not, it's usually when a chimp eats a leaf, they'll kind of chew it, put a bunch in their mouth and chew it up and swallow it. But with leaf swallowing, they'll very carefully select a leaf, and then they'll take the whole leaf and they'll kind of fold it into their mouth very slowly with their tongue. And it looks totally weird. You couldn't mistake it for feeding. And what happens is, as they fold it in this very careful way and swallow it, the leaves that they select for this behavior have these tiny Velcro-like hooks called trichomes. And you might kind of be familiar with leaves like this. It's when, sometimes you'll touch a blade of grass and it feels sticky to the touch. Mm-hmm. That stickiness is actually those trichomes exhibiting kind of this Velcro-like effect. And these tiny hooks are actually hooking to your skin. Mm-hmm. So when they swallow these, and the leaves, when they have that kind of leaf surface roughness, they're called hispid leaves. So they'll swallow these hispid leaves in this funny little pouch. And as it travels through their gut, those leaves will grab any kind of any nematodes or internal parasites from their gut wall and expel them as it passes through. So it's been shown to kind of be effective as an anthelmintic, which means an anti-parasitic behavior against not all parasite species. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't rid their gut of all parasites, but certain species of parasite, like this one Osteophagostomus that many chimpanzees at, most chimpanzee sites, I think all chimpanzee sites will have Osteophagostomus parasite infection. So that's one. And really interestingly also, that behavior is not unique to chimpanzees. It's been observed across the animal kingdom. There's evidence that civets, leaf swallow, bears, geese, a bunch of animals from across the animal kingdom. So that's really cool, kind of from an evolutionary perspective. And yeah, we can go back into sort of whether or not that is, an instinctual genetic thing or a learned thing. That's also kind of an interesting follow-up topic. But then the second self-medicated behavior is called bitter pith chewing. And bitter pith chewing, so if you notice in that first case, what's actually happening is it's a mechanical behavior. So it has something to do with the morphology rather than the chemical composition of that leaf. Yeah. But bitter pith chewing is a chemical self-medicated behavior. So it actually is, there's bioactive properties in this certain plant species called Vernonia amygdalina. And this behavior was observed by my PhD supervisor in the Mahale Mountains in Tanzania. And it's this plant has a very, very bitter pith in the stem. And my supervisor, Michael Huffman, noticed that very sick chimps were going to this plant and they were peeling stripping the pith and chewing on the kind of the inside, the bitter juices and fibers. And what he noticed is that after they did this behavior, their health state was improving, and specifically their parasite infections. And there were a couple of parasites that were shown in the kind of later years that this actually, it effectively reduces certain species of parasite infections chemically. So those are the two kind of best studied chimpanzee self-medicated behaviors. But my PhD was trying to kind of discover new self-medicated behaviors. Several people have also kind of, since those two behaviors have been discovered, set out to kind of discover new ones. And there are many other what we call putative self-medicated behaviors, suspect self-medicated behaviors, none as established as those two. But everything from clay eating, certain soils, termite soil, certain plant species. There's an amazing review that came out last year that kind of runs through every species that's been put out as suspect and the evidence. And there's many, many, many of them.
Incredible.
So does that mean that across species, there's also a larger variety of different types of self-medicated behaviors?
Yeah, so across the animal kingdom, there are insane cases of animal self-medication. So dolphins are known to swim and rub their skin against certain coral to potentially treat fungal infections. You have birds like great bustard birds that are thought to eat certain anti-parasitic plants during mating season to increase their fitness. You have all sorts of one of my favorite cases, which is actually kind of an interesting example, is monarch butterflies have been shown to they'll selectively lay their eggs on certain milkweed species that have anti-fungal properties against this certain type of it's maybe not a fungus, it's a parasite that can. It's a big monarch killer, and it grows like scales on their wings. And monarchs feed on plenty of types of milkweed species, but there's one particular species that has this. Actually, let me rephrase that because I'm not sure that's 100% accurate. I'm going to start again.
Yeah.
Okay. Monarch species are plagued by this parasite that grows like scales on their wings and can be very fatal to monarch populations. And they'll selectively, when given a choice between milkweed species that have anti-parasitic compounds that can help defend against this parasite, will lay their eggs on that particular species rather than the others that lack those compounds, so that when their eggs are born without that infection. So an interesting example of potentially, a form of intergenerational self-medication where the monarch isn't necessarily treating their own infection, but they're helping prevent the infection in their offspring. So lots all around the animal kingdom, amazing examples of this, from, insect to mammals to all around. And we're still discovering, every few years there's another amazing discovery. More people are studying it now. And I think we're going to keep learning more and more animals around us are engaging in self-medication. It's just sort of a matter of getting people interested in the topic again, because there was kind of a long lull. There was a big boom in the 90s where a lot of people were studying it, and then there's just been sort of a lull, I would say, over the last decade or two. And I think part of that actually goes back to this burden of proof on what you need to show in order to establish a self-medicative behavior.
Okay, so what do you need to show?
So what you need to show, so there's, it obviously depends on kind of what behaviors you're looking at, what species you're looking at, but kind of typically there's a number of criteria that you want to meet. And I'll try to remember these off the top of my head. I might miss a few, and I might, spend more time focusing on some, but because they have different levels of importance, obviously, depending on the species and the case. But first and foremost, you kind of want to look at whether or not a animal is sick when they're seeking out a certain behavior. Yeah. So to do that, you have to be health monitoring your species. You need to you need to have a sense of whether or not what they're sick with, right? Then you need to observe them eating something strange, and that's kind of also a key point, that it has to be sort of an unusual behavior, because it's not something that unless they're sick all the time, it's not something that's probably going to be part of their normal diet. So it's an unusual feeding event. Then you need to kind of be in the right place at the right time and check their health immediately following that event to make sure that their health state has improved. And then that kind of, it conjures more questions of what's the time window that you're looking at. Is it, a day? Is it a week? Depends on what the illness is. Depends what the symptoms of that illness are. Then you want to show the mechanism, why that, certain food or certain plant or resource worked as an effective treatment for that specific illness. So what was the mechanism? Was it mechanical, like leaf swallowing? Was it chemical, like bitter pith chewing? Then you also, if it is a chemical self-medicative event, you want to have the pharmacological backing, what compounds. It's helpful to know whether or not that plant species is also used ethnomedicinally by people. So, that's not gonna necessarily be a required criteria, but it absolutely helps your case if you can show that it's kind of a known medicine people use. I mean, and there's several others, but I think those are kind of some of the big ones. Another one that's not maybe one of the classic criteria, but if an animal will go maybe to an unusual place or take an unusual route or leave the group, in the case of chimpanzees, go off on their own. For example, if there's one sick animal, one sick chimpanzee, and they're in a group and they maybe go off and eat something that none of the other chimps are eating, that adds to your case that it's something that's not a typical food for the chimpanzees. So there's all of this kind of little pieces of evidence that you kind of use to triangulate and make your case. And one of the reasons I think, funding and PhD projects sort of dried up on the topic was because, say you're a PhD student, you have 3-4 years to do a PhD, you have, a year of field work. You have to be, one of the criteria is that it's a rare event. So you're kind of walking into a project where you might not even see the event that you're doing your PhD on. And so it's risky. And I think that, a lot of people warned me before I did my PhD, like, are you sure you want to do this? You could go and you could never see self-medication. And what are you going to do in that case? And I think the best advice I would have for people interested in studying self-medication is self-medication happens, I think, a lot more frequently than we think it does. If you go in looking just for leaf swallowing, I was in the field for 9.5 months. I saw leaf swallowing one time. So if I were just studying leaf swallowing, I would have failed my PhD. But that is by no means the only self-medicated behaviors that chimpanzees have. You just have to be very open-minded, and you need to sort of treat the study of chimps as more of an anthropological project. You're a fly on the wall. You're watching everything they do as a potential self-medicative behavior, and you're using all the clues that you possibly have about their health, about what people in the local village use as medicine. You're basically being a detective to piece together what any feeding event could be a potential self-medicated behavior, and you're just trying to prove it rather than go in looking for one type of behavior. So I think that was that was a barrier to entry for, I think, PhD students and researchers going into the field, that it just seemed risky. But the reality is you might not get the perfect case. You might not see a sick chimp, see them eat something unusual, get their health the day after, get all of the evidence. But what you can do, if you have an open enough mind and you're, observant, I guess, and you spend the time, in the forest watching everything the chimps are doing, you're likely going to see something, and you're likely going to find something new.
Yeah. I imagine that with your approach of just observing their behavior, it's like every behavior they do is almost novel or worthwhile jotting down just to add to the data collection that exists. I have so many follow-up questions about social evolution, but just going off of what you've been talking about now, I'm really curious about the day-to-day of what it's like to do field work. So you've mentioned you did field work in Ugandan forests. Could you tell us a bit about that experience and, for example, the challenges of data collection after a self-medication event?
Yeah, well, so fieldwork is amazing. I think it's kind of the reason I did the PhD in the first place was I wanted to get to the field. I'd read papers on chimps. I had, I'd spent my life obsessing about them, but I wanted to actually be in the wild and be in the forest and see how chimpanzees are kind of when it's, just you and them and how they are in their natural habitat. It's an amazing experience. So the way a field site works, or the way my field site worked, I was working at Budongo Conservation Field Station, which is in western Uganda. And I got there during COVID, so it was a little bit funny. There weren't as many researchers there during my first field season as usual. But it's a camp in the middle of the forest. So it's about 3 or 4 miles to the closest village down this little dirt road. You cut through the Budongo Forest, and it's this little opening in the forest, and you have a couple of little houses with tin roofs, and there's solar electricity that's on and off, no running water. We collect water in big tanks, and that's what we use to shower, and it's an amazing place. All around you, you have hyraxes screaming, you have hornbills, which are these giant birds that when they flap, it sounds like a dinosaur is flying over your head. Gray parrots flying over. There's, it's incredible. There's, in addition to the chimps in the forest, there's also a number of different primate species. So you can sit outside your room and you can see the baboons come in as a giant troop. There are colobus monkeys calling in the trees. There are blue monkeys, there are red-tailed monkeys. It's like there are dikers, which are like a type of antelope that just gallop through. So it's insane. You can spend all day just sitting in camp and have the most incredible, experience.
Hi, I'm just cutting in here to let you know that we've included a short segment at the end of the episode, which is a recording that Elodie took when she was in the Budongo jungle. And so I highly recommend staying tuned until then to get a taste of the sounds that she's referring to here. And now back to the episode.
That to me was kind of the most striking first impression, is just the sounds, because it's, especially when I first arrived at the station during my first kind of fieldwork season, I arrived at night, and because it was COVID, I had to immediately go into this quarantine house for 2 weeks, and I didn't know what, I didn't know anything. All of the sounds were new to me, and the first thing I heard was I got into bed, I was just going to sleep, and I heard the sound of a hyrax screaming, which if anyone is interested, Google it. A forest hyrax scream sounds like the most shrieking human scream you could ever hear, and it was coming from all around me, and my first thought was someone is being murdered in the forest, and I panicked. So yeah, the soundscape is incredible. And then actually what a day in the life looks like is you wake up really early. So chimps call when they wake up. So chimps are a nesting species. They sleep in trees, and they will, when they wake up, as they come down from their nests, they'll call. And so our aim was to be in the forest before they called so we could hear where they were. Because you can hear chimps from pretty far off, but you want to be close enough that you can identify where that sound is coming from. So every PhD researcher is matched with a Ugandan member of the field staff there, who are unbelievable primatologists. They're, the gurus of the forest. They know everything about chimps. They know everything about chimp behavior. And they're very much, if you're a PhD student, you're teacher in the field. So they teach you how to trek through the forest. They teach you how to find the chimps. They interpret the behaviors when you're first getting started. And you still, when I came, I was very green. I didn't know, I had read what, chimpanzee calls were, but I didn't actually know what they sounded like. I didn't know what they meant. Yeah. So the field primatologist that you're working with is really the expert teacher. And they also, really importantly, teach you how to identify the chimps, because that's something that you need to do in order to take behavioral data. You need to be able to tell the chimps apart, which chimps are which. And so I worked with neighboring communities when I was there. My first field season was with one community called Sanso. The second was with Waibira nearby. And in Waibira, there were like over 120 chimps, and you have to be able to tell them apart very quickly. And that's a really difficult task. And so the field primatologists you're working with, they are unbelievable, and they can really, for the first few months, help you, identify them. So you wake up, you go into the forest you meet up with your field primatologist colleague, you trek into the forest, depending on which community I was working in. In Sanso, our base camp was in the middle of the territory. Chimps are territorial, so they have these pretty delineated, pretty large territories. And base camp is in the center. So sometimes the chimps, you didn't have to trek at all. The chimps would come pick you up in the morning and you'd go off with them. But with Waibira, which was farther out, you had to wake up and hike about an hour in. And if you weren't up early enough or you were late and you missed their calls, that was it. You'd spend the day just walking kilometers and kilometers back and forth trying to find them. And sometimes you never found them. So really important you get there on time. And then once you find them, if you find them, because again, many days we didn't, you pick a focal. So, and this is just the way that I did my data collection, but this is, I would say, pretty common. So you pick a focal for that day. So an individual that you're really interested in studying. And for me, that was a chimp that met certain criteria. So if I had, for example, seen that a chimp had a very high parasite infection recently, or if I had seen a chimp eating something strange, or I had this list of criteria. And so I would pick, your chimp, say my favorite chimp is Ozzy, so I'll use Ozzy as an example. So you pick Ozzy, and then your day becomes about staying with Ozzy and not losing Ozzy, and writing down everything Ozzy does, what Ozzy eats, who Ozzy grooms, and if Ozzy made a poop, I would collect the poop, because a really important part of my data collection methods was health monitoring and parasite monitoring. So having fecal samples was really important. I also took urine samples to assess many metrics about their health, whether they had infections or high ketones or whatever it was. I would take, if there was anything that Ozzy ate that was a plant species that I couldn't identify, or my field colleague couldn't identify, we'd collect samples. So I had a botanical press usually with me. And I also, I was collecting my data on an iPad using this really cool app called Animal Observer. But I also, as you were mentioning earlier, I kind of used this anthropological methodology that I think my background in anthropology in my undergrad, I'm used to sort of ethnographic note-taking. So in addition to my data collection on my iPad, which has sort of pre-coded behaviors that if Ozzy grooms, another chimp, then I would put on my iPad, it's a bunch of buttons basically, but it's very limiting because there's all of these variables that are uncodable. And the examples I usually use for that are like, sometimes there would be a party in the village and you can hear the music from the party, right? And that's something that's uncodable. Yeah. But that might impact how close they go to the village, where, how well they slept the night before. Like if they're agitated, if there's more tension in the group, if there's more fighting, or if it was pouring rain, or if it poured rain yesterday and the ground was really wet, maybe they're going to spend more time in the trees. So I used my notebook to write down behaviors or ecological, factors that you can't code with a button. You have to kind of explain. And that became kind of one of the most important data sources for me when I was writing up and when I was writing my papers, because I could go to the specific day where, say, later in the day, I see Ozzy eat something incredible or do something, a behavior that I think is self-medicative. All of those other uncodable behaviors or external factors could absolutely impact that behavior, and that became really important for me anecdotally. So you do that all day long from about 5 a.m. until 4:30 at night. 5 at night, you wind your way back to camp, and then you back up data, which takes a really long time because I would type up all of my notes. I would double back up all my videos. That was another really important thing that I just took for granted. I took videos of everything. So I always had my tiny camcorder. Anytime they ate or did anything, I filmed it, because kind of the rule of thumb is if you didn't get it on camera, it didn't really, it happened, but you can't prove it. Pixar, it didn't happen. No, but it's, because your memory is very faulty. And this happened all the time for me. I thought I saw something and I would watch my video and it would be completely different. It was the wrong chimp, or it was the wrong species of plant that I had identified. And so while you can see something incredible and you can try to believe your memory, there's no way to go back and prove it happened, and there's no way to kind of confirm the things that you suspected. And you might have missed, there's so many small things happening on any given time when you're following chimps, tensions or dynamics between chimps in the background, like certain calls that are happening, whatever it is. So videos are really important. So I would take all my videos back. I would label all my videos. I would get my fecal samples to the lab for my amazing colleague, Daniel Sempepo would help me with all my parasitology, because he's this incredible parasitologist. So he would start work on identifying the parasites in the samples. And then I would try to take some time outside and decompress and read a book or sketch. And then we eat dinner as a group at the field station. So all the researchers and field staff have some dinner together, and then you got to go to bed. You wake up really early the next day. So it's a really busy life. It's very, compact, intense few months, but it's incredible. And you have such a rush every day. You wake up every day and you have no idea what you're going to see that day. You could see some totally novel behavior. You could wind up spending the whole day watching chimps fast asleep, in a tree doing nothing. But it's still, if the chimps aren't doing something, then you see some amazing chameleon or a dung beetle or some bird, or so you never have a day where you don't have something spectacular happen to you.
Incredible.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. It sounds so intense, but so immersive. And wow, it must be weird to then go back to Oxford and just do all the analysis and be away from it, but still knowing that was part of your memory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was always a culture shock coming home where you're just, but also what's amazing is when, again, reading in the writing, getting to read through the notes and remember and put yourself back in those. I don't think there's a single day in my field notebook where I can't remember that day. Every day was unique. So it's fun getting to go back and write the papers now, because I remember the morning and everything the chimps were doing the morning of the cool event that happened in the evening. You get to kind of relive as you're writing, which is really fun.
Yeah.
So in your research in the Budongo jungle, what did you find? Was it only plants, or did you see any other types of self-medicating?
So I've talked about these two established self-medicated behaviors, and what I was trying to do when I got to Budongo, because no one had really systematically at that field site, at the Budongo Conservation Field Station, done a systematic observation period looking for novel self-medicated behaviors. So we knew leaf swallowing happened at Budongo, but we didn't really know anything else about their, potential medicinal behaviors. Someone had done this amazing study on clay eating and concluded that it was, possible that clay is a self-medicated behavior. So that was something that was on my radar. I was looking at clay eating. I had camera traps set up in the clay pits. But what my focus became was bark feeding. So, which had been proposed in the past as a self-medicated behavior. So bark feeding just refers to what it sounds like, chimps eating bark.
And is that chemical or mechanical?
Right. So that's a good question. So without jumping to the end, chemical. Chemical. But, we didn't really know much about it. It had been proposed for the reason that across the world, people in many different cultures use bark as a medicine.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
A very common, because barks tend to be very bioactive. And keeping in mind when I say bark, I'm not saying that all barks of all trees are medicinal. I'm talking about specific barks.
Just keep thinking about cinnamon.
Exactly. And willow bark. And there's a lot of barks that have been shown to to have medicinal value for us as well. But what drew me to the idea of bark is that bark feeding, it's rare in chimps, but it's not that rare in chimps. And so I wanted to know if we can show that certain barks are medicinal, then we increase our sample sizes of self-medicative events across many different field stations by so much.
Yeah.
Because people have been coding in their long-term coding schemes from all these field stations bark feeding events for years. So if we can show any of these are self-medicated behaviors, we can backtrack and look at our past data. But something that here is really important, as I said, not clump all barks together into one. It would be like saying fruit eating.
Yeah.
We're talking about certain barks.
Yeah.
So what I noticed was, in the past, the function of bark feeding has been considered to be as a fallback food. And what that means is a food eaten during periods of food scarcity when priority foods or staple foods are scarce. So the idea is chimps are hungry, they're opportunistically walking through the forest looking for something to eat. There's bark on trees. Bark is very nutritionally poor. It doesn't have that many calories. It's energetically expensive to exploit, but chimps will eat it because they're hungry. And there's a few studies that look at this, and what they tend to do is clump all barks together and look at seasonality trends. And when you clump all barks together and you look at seasonality trends, what you'll see is this exact proof for the fallback food hypothesis, or, what looks like proof for the fallback hypothesis. You'll see bark feeding, again, generally increasing during periods in which fruit or staple foods decrease, and then vice versa. But what I noticed is when you tear kind of that generalization apart and you go species by species, that pattern completely breaks down. And I have a paper coming out about this very soon, which I'm excited about. But when you don't clump and you look at a species level, you see some trees where that absolutely meets that hypothesis. And those trees tend to also be the most commonly fed on barks. So they completely skew the data toward looking like all species follow that pattern. But some species are eaten much more rarely, and they're eaten during periods where staple foods are very, very present. So it's a decision. Instead of targeting, the delicious, caloric, sweet fruit that they prefer, they're going after really energetically expensive, nutritionally poor barks. Yeah. And sometimes what I also found is they're traveling really far distances to access it. So beginning to see some of these criteria of the self-medication hypothesis that we talked about earlier. And the more kind of I looked at these specific trees that were showing different seasonality than the fallback food hypothesis barks, the more those specific trees started to kind of begin to show more evidence of self-medication. So I took a bunch of those barks to the lab and I tested them for pharmacological properties, and a lot of them had these very bioactive characteristics, and they were antibacterial or anti-inflammatory. And then I went to the village and I talked to a bunch of healers, and I found that those barks had a lot of ethnomedicinal uses.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to what you mentioned earlier about whether these self-medicating behaviors are more innate or learned.
Yeah, so that's an incredible question, and something that kind of had stumped zoopharmacognostists for a while, or is this big question in the field, was whether it is genetically encoded or socially transmitted. And so what the past literature has done is kind of tackled that question using some captive studies. And again, so self-medication was kind of established in the 80s, 90s. Then toward the 2000s, there was this shift. And the shift was focusing on this question. And so they looked at, and this is also research that was done by one of my PhD supervisors, Mike Huffman. They looked at this behavior, leaf swallowing, that I talked about earlier. And they, in a captive chimp population that was naive, so they had never been in the wild. They had never been exposed to leaf swallowing in the wild, and they knew this. They put into the enclosure some leaves with this hispid leaf surface roughness, right? So it has the morphological characteristics that are necessary to do the behavior. And they wanted to see, can chimps spontaneously innovate this behavior? And what they found was, yes, they can. And so a couple of naive chimps, only a few of them, began to leaf swallow. But interestingly, even though these leaves were in the enclosure for quite some time, some members of the population never innovated the behavior and never started leaf swallowing. So,
is it because they just were not ill, or?
well, that was another interesting component of it. The chimps weren't necessarily ill, but they had this instinctual tendency toward when interacting with this leaf surface, leaf swallowing. So
almost preventative.
Right, exactly. And preventative self-medication is in itself a really interesting other component of self-medication.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were saying the criteria that's very much selecting towards like treatment, because you need to make sure they're ill first and everything. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's an incredible point, that there's these two kind of types of self-medication, and you have to study them in very different ways. One is therapeutic self-medication, which is a sick animal seeks out a cure for that specific illness, and one is preventative, which is, for example, when we eat garlic.
Yeah.
You know, we cook with garlic all the time. That has medicinal properties that could potentially be working prophylactically to prevent illness. So, but obviously, proving a preventative self-medication event, which could be just a normal food, is so much harder. And this is also something that has prevented people from studying self-medication for a really long time, because pulling those things apart is really frustrating and really difficult. And peer review, for example, if you're publishing a journal paper, can just be absolutely impossible.
It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. But so that's a really good point, that there is this difference between preventative and therapeutic. So basically, in this enclosure, they noticed some chimps were leaf swallowing spontaneously and some weren't. But really interestingly, what they also found was the chimps that didn't innovate it spontaneously, who were originally neophobic, so avoiding these hispid leaves because they were unusual and they're different and they weren't a normal food, started watching the chimps that had innovated it spontaneously and started copying them. And so then there was a second study where they had two different enclosures, similar setup, experimental setup, two different enclosures, two different naive chimp groups. And they introduced these hispid leaves. And what they noticed is between the two different leaf groups, again, similarly, only a few spontaneously started leaf swallowing. Two different variations of leaf swallowing occurred. One called partial leaf swallowing and one called, I think it was whole leaf swallowing, basically slightly different techniques for leaf swallowing. And what they noticed was in those two different separate enclosures, the chimps that didn't spontaneously begin to leaf swallow again started copying the initial innovators, and they picked up those different variants. So in the different enclosures, two different variants emerged and then were socially transmitted. So what is really cool there is that on one hand, it shows that there is, for leaf swallowing, a genetic instinct amongst at least some chimps, but also that social transmission can occur, and therefore the creation of variants or potential, differences in culture of, medicinal techniques. So really interesting. In chemical self-medication, there has not been that type of systematic investigation into how it occurs. But what I would say is that there are so many plants in the forest. There are so many. And there are so many plants in the forest that are toxic and that are poisonous to eat. And chimps are very neophobic animals. So if chimps, they won't go near, they don't like things they don't know. And to eat. They're very, very careful and picky about their diets, because you have to be. If you live in the wild, you eat the wrong mushroom, you're dead. You chew the wrong bark, whatever it is, you can't take that many chances. So chimps tend to be neophobic. So especially also when a chimp is sick, they're not going to go around popping things into their mouth. They have low energy. They're likely not moving much. They don't have much time. So a trial and error strategy we can eliminate for the most part, assuming that, not every time they're sick, they're not reinventing the wheel. And potentially with mechanical self-medication, there could be instincts to, select certain textures of leaves or certain morphological properties of certain foods. And that's absolutely could be responsible for some self-medicative events.
Especially in that case of the captive group that hadn't been exposed to it previously. Instinctively, some of them started.
Absolutely. And that we can attribute to the morphological characteristic of the leaf, something encoded. They knew to use that behavior on that leaf. But with the chemical self-medication, with self-medication that involves targeting pharmacological compounds that exist in certain plant species, it seems like it would be more complicated for that to be genetically encoded.
I guess what I just randomly thought of was, as you mentioned, garlic, and I just thought of wild garlic, which is like in season right now, and how maybe through smell they could identify like similar things to what they're used to ingesting, and that would suggest that it's more okay or equally
Absolutely.
beneficial?
Smell, taste has been commonly bitter taste. So medicinal materials tend to be very bitter because they tend to be high, and we're talking about chemical self-medication now, high in plant secondary metabolites, which are these compounds that are produced by plants as a defense mechanism, and they can be produced when the plant is under attack by a predator or a herbivore or a pathogen or a fungus. They'll produce these plant defense compounds, and those same compounds that help protect the plant also are the medicinal compounds that help protect us or animals when they're eaten, and that they tend to have a bitter taste. So yeah, there could be a bitter taste perception, and there have been studies that have looked at whether or not chimps have the gene for tasting bitterness, and many do. But yeah, so there could be different environmental cues, like taste or smell or whatever. But the question is, can you have a genetic tendency towards certain species of plants? And I would argue that it's on a species level, there's no way you've evolved the ability to identify one specific plant species. And assuming that different plant species have a range of different bioactive properties, it just seems too difficult to have that genetic encoding for the selection of certain species. And so for chemical self-medication, it's this really cool question now, which is, okay, if it's not innate, then how are they learning it? How are they learning which species to select? And really interestingly also the dose, because dose makes a huge difference. And especially with these plant secondary metabolites that I've talked about, they can be very medicinal in the right doses, but they can also be fatal in too big of a dose, and they can be ineffective in too little of a dose. So it's not just the identification of the medicinal resource that the chimps have to have, it's also the quantity that they need to take. And slipping up could mean life or death. It could mean either not treating the ailment or overdosing and dying. So it's a very, very honed skill set that they have to have. And so the question that I wanted to answer in my master's, or that I explored, is how could it be socially transmitted? How could a young chimp, how could Ozzy, the young juvenile chimp in so-and-so, learn when he's sick which plant to use and how much of it, and how to ingest it, how to exploit it? And I, in my master's, was looking at potentially gestural communication. Could there be gestures that help differentiate? For example, if he's watching his mother self-medicate, does she gesture in a different way to him or communicate to him that this isn't a normal feeding resource? Don't eat this normally. Eat this when you're sick. And I didn't have the data to look at it, but I can tell from in the field, when I did see cases of what I thought were self-medication, I didn't tend to see any obvious gestures, but we don't know yet, and that's one of the biggest, to me, coolest open questions about this field. What mode of communication are they using to communicate to learners, young chimpanzees in the group, how, when, why to use certain resources? So there's a lot of kind of open questions about that. I had a follow-up question that I think maybe can relate a little bit to the communication, in that I read this paper about how in 2019 they found these chimpanzees that would allomedicate. I think that was the term they used in the paper, where basically they would medicate others that were ill. And in this paper they were looking at insects, where they would rub insects on open wounds, and so they weren't self-medicating, they were medicating others. And one, this shows an enormous amount of pro-social behavior and also selflessness, and two, maybe that relates a little bit to the communication, in the sense of like, maybe they don't need to gesture it, but these younger chimpanzees learn that on a circumstantial basis, associate the signals and the symptoms of a chimpanzee looking more ill to, okay, when you look like that, when you feel like that, you then do this, eat this bark, eat this plant, rub this insect.
Or like similar to humans, like when you're ill as a child, your mom gives you medicine, so then that's how you know to eat that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really cool paper. That research is incredible. And the insect pro-social wound care is incredible. I'm just finishing a paper now about the same thing from observations in Budongo of pro-social, not only pro-social wound care, like licking each other's wounds and applying leaves to each other's wounds with potential medicinal properties, but also helping each other escape from snares, and pro-social hygiene behaviors, helping each other wipe off certain areas that are potentially dirty. So really cool implications for prosociality as well. But yeah, going back to kind of how this could affect sort of the social transmission, the way that I always saw it, the way that I kind of the metaphor that I gave for myself for constructing a methodology for looking at this in my master's was I thought, okay, so say I'm a young child and my mother is sick. What are the ways that I might know that my mom is going to take a medicine versus eat a food? So the first way would be my mom might tell me, right? I'm sick. I'm going to take a medicine, not a food. So that's language, communication, some sort of transmission of verbal or gestural information. The second is she might go to a different location than she normally goes. So usually she goes to the fridge, but I might see her go to the medicine cabinet instead. So I might clock that we're going to a new place. Mm-hmm. And third, the resource might look different. So usually, let's say she's eating a can of olives, but now she's opening a container of ibuprofen. So the actual physical resource is different than what I'm used to. And so I use that to kind of construct different modes of studying this. So I looked, okay, so maybe it's gestural communication, so that's the language side. And then I was and this is part of my PhD research too, but I was looking at different localities using GPS of are they going to different parts of the forest to self-medicate versus the parts that they normally go get food? Are they traveling farther distances, et cetera, et cetera? And third, are the actual physical resources, different in type or shape or morphology or whatever it is? Or just, for example, when I started focusing on bark, is bark, is that a strange food for a chimp? How unusual is bark feeding compared to fruit eating or, leaf eating or whatever it is? So there's a number of different kind of ways that a young chimp might know. And some of the open questions are, as you mentioned, smell. Could chimps, for example, be able to smell illness in others in a way that we can't? Because one of the things about self-medication that's so cool is that it's an relatively opaque behavior. So I could be sick and I could have a stomach ache right now, and you might not necessarily know.
Yeah.
Because you can't, it's not like a technological behavior, for example, so take nut cracking in chimps, for example. So you have a young chimp that wants to learn how to nut crack. And it's a technological behavior, so I'm their mother or the model, and I'm nut cracking. They can sit and watch me nut crack. That's a very transparent behavior. I have a goal in mind. I want to open this nut. They see me set up the nut crack. They see me crack the nut, and they see me eat the nut. They see all parts of that behavior. With self-medication, it's more opaque because it's internal rather than external. The point A, me being sick, to point B, me getting better, might not be visible to an outside observer. And so the behavior that actually gets me from point A to point B, unlike cracking a nut, which I could watch, you don't have any sort of before and after context. So the question is, how does a young chimp know, for example, that another member of their community is sick to even know to watch them in the first place?
Yeah.
And one idea is that they can smell, for example, a parasite infection. They might have more minute clues that an individual is not feeling well. There might be slight disruptions to their normal behaviors. They might be eating less. They might be more lethargic. But that's a huge open question as well. How are they identifying sickness? And then who are the models? Yeah. Is it horizontal transmission? Are they watching, are juveniles watching other juveniles? Yeah. Or is it vertical? Are they watching their mothers or other older members of the group? So there's a number of different theories. I thought going in, my hypothesis was that young chimps tend to watch their mothers, and they tend to potentially identify parasite infections or sickness using more subtle clues than we were necessarily aware of. But of course, it could also be that, like you said, mothers are sick, and the young juvenile, their young offspring, doesn't have to identify them being sick because the mother pulls them aside and indicates to them that she's sick and has an illness, and pay attention, I'm about to do something that is going to be relevant to you one day when you're older. So lots of open questions, super interesting, would be my dream, question one day to answer, but we just don't have the data yet. And that's why my PhD I backtracked from my master's, and I said, okay, in order to answer these complex questions about social transmission, we need to find more self-medicated behavior so we can have data sets and sample sizes that are big enough that we can actually start looking at answering kind of these bigger questions that require more robust data sets.
I have two things to say. Firstly, when you were saying your metaphor of what does my mom do when I'm sick, I was thinking maybe this is an advantage of studying chimpanzees, which are like one of our closest relatives, even though their behaviors can be, I'm sure, so different from humans in so many ways. But like, you wouldn't be able to do that if you were studying like mice or insects, because you just cannot compare. You can't be like, you just can't assume they even have a relationship with their mother in that way. So that was an interesting thought. And the other thing I wanted to say was kind of extending this learned behavior beyond chimpanzees and into humans as well, because I know, as you mentioned, you did some interviews with traditional healers from the local villages and found some similarities in like the bark that they use, for example. And I was wondering, do you know how much these human communities learn from animals of the rainforest? How do humans find these medicines, and is it learned as well from other animals?
I absolutely love this question. This question to me is so cool. And yeah, it's something that's a really fun kind of topic. And there's an amazing paper. One of my supervisors, also Mike Huffman, that I've mentioned a few times, who's kind of a very important founder of this field of zoopharmacognosy, wrote this amazing paper. I think it came out in 2022, running through all of these folkloric accounts of people, of people that have learned about medicinal resources or medication techniques through watching animals in the wild. And it absolutely happens. I think during some of my interviews, I think it came up once or twice. And it wasn't actually specifically self-medication, but I was asking about this certain species of dead wood that the chimps eat, which I thought I had tested in the lab, and I found it had some pharmacological properties. In the past, it's been thought to be targeted for sodium because it has very high sodium content. And again, I will say that for all of these self-medicated behaviors, they could be targeted for more than one thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, I mean, when you get really into self-medication, you start to think of these things as mutually exclusive. Like, it's either for nutrition, or it's for minerals, or it's for, medicinal compounds. But all of these things, like if you look at our diets, it's complicated. You could have all three, and just because it has high sodium content doesn't mean it's not a medicinal behavior as well, right? So that's something that you have to kind of untangle when you get too deep in the weeds in this topic. But it's high in sodium, but it also potentially has medicinal properties, which I found in my pharmacological test as well. And what one of the healers was saying was and these healers all live on the forest edge. So all the healers I talked to live very close to the forest. They get all of their medicines from the trees within the forest. So they spend a lot of time in the forest. And all of them, know the chimpanzees, watch the chimpanzees, have experiences with the chimpanzees. And they were saying that someone in the village had seen a chimp drinking water from a hollowed out log of this species of dead wood that I was interested in. And that after the chimp was kind of, a little muddled around and kind of wandering off a little funny. And they started drinking that fermented water as well. And that they found that it had, I guess, an high ethanol content, and they were feeling a little drunk as well. So they learned that from watching. That was a social transmission event between across species, which is so cool. One of the cases that I love is one of the ways that self-medication was discovered in non-human animals was from this initial story that was told about this porcupine who, I think it had bloody stool, and it went into, right by the forest, and it dug up this root, and it ate the root, which was very unusual, and it subsequently got better. It improved. And so this healer that had observed this dug up the root also, and when he had a patient that also had a bloody stool, he gave them the root. I think he actually tested on himself first. And the patient got better. And that is how sort of this story got told, and that planted the seeds for some researchers to start looking into zoopharmacognosy. Or that's the case that's Mike Huffman often uses to explain sort of the origins of how the thought percolated that this could happen. So people have known animals self-medicate forever. It's just a question of when the scientific community started treating it like this was a valid topic to study, and that's another hugely, all of this when I talk about all of these medicinal resources, I found a bunch of barks that were highly medicinal and really interesting and potentially self-medicated for chimps, but so many forest edge communities and traditional healers have been using these barks for generations and generations and generations. These are not plants that are new to be known as medicines. These are just plants that the scientific community is finally going to accept as medicines, because that's how science unfortunately works, and traditional knowledge is not, often accepted as valid proof. Yeah, so there's a number of cases, and actually I was reading a paper recently about the origins of quinine, and the discovery of quinine for treating malaria.
Yeah.
And apparently one of the myths about this, I think it was amongst the Quechua people, I believe it was in Peru, there was a myth that they saw a lion that was very sick eating quinine or the bark of the cinchona tree. So even potentially quinine came from the myth of an animal self-medicating. So this is something that we've known about forever. It was just taken, I guess, for granted for so long that the animal could be intentionally self-medicating.
Yeah.
And once you kind of unlock these non-human medicinal traditions or medicinal repertoires, it opens so much opportunity for learning more about the cognition of those animals, learning about potential drug discovery that could help, us if it's done responsibly and it's not done in an exploitative way. And that's another, this is a very important point, that bioprospecting, biopiracy, bad actors coming in for the last few centuries, this has been a huge issue with pharma companies or colonial settlers coming in and taking medicinal trees or medicinal resources and exporting them, synthesizing them, exploiting them with traditional, with local communities and not getting any benefit sharing, having their information stolen and having the habitats destroyed, impacting animals' access to these resources as well. This has been going on for centuries. This is a huge issue, and this is something that is very scary to me about this research as well, that if in the wrong hands, it can be exploited, and which is why I'm trying to, in my own research, try to get out in front of it and try to figure out how we can. In my papers, I never publish specific information from my ethnomedicinal interviews, and that was a choice that was made because of all of this history of biopiracy and bioprospecting, and you have to be really careful when you with what you do with your data. And everything you publish is a decision that has to be thought out. What tree could I be putting in jeopardy by putting this information out, and what chimp community could be impacted by this, and what forest could be, so there's a lot of ethical kind of thought.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's really important.
It is such an important topic. Just off the top of my head, is it any way possible to, for example, if you find a bioactive compound or bark or plant that is medicinal, if you alongside the healers or the communities, can you both patent it so that if pharma companies do try and exploit it, at least both the researchers and the local communities can benefit from it? Or do you have any knowledge of it?
It's an amazing question. I think what's really important is making sure that a protocol is in place is going to be really important for making sure that as zoopharmacognosy becomes a trendier and trendier topic to study. I mean, just last week there was this huge paper that swept the internet about orangutan wound care.
I saw that,
It's amazing. It's becoming, people are actually getting really interested in it now. And as we move into this new, period, hopefully, where zoopharmacognosy is going to get more attention, more funding, fingers crossed, I think it's going to be incredibly important that we close those loopholes in how to, how people right now can skirt around ethics boards. And I think the most important thing will be ensuring equal benefit sharing between local communities, potentially the animals in the forest, making sure that no paper is going to compromise the livelihood and the cultural well-being of the forest edge communities, and in addition to the right to survive of the animal populations that are living there. And we've talked about chimps, but as I mentioned, self-medication spans the animal kingdom. So these same resources that the chimps use, when I had camera traps set up, when I began to identify some of the barks that I was interested in, some of the tree species, and when in the clay pits, all of these, I had camera traps around the forest. And it's not just the chimps that would come to these trees. I would see other species of monkeys. I would see the dikers that I mentioned come feeding on it, bush bucks come feeding on it, birds come feeding on it. So potentially these medicinal resources are highly important to the survival and the health maintenance of the entire ecosystem living in these forests. And losing one species of tree could compromise the well-being. It could remove a resource that was keeping the ecosystem healthy, which is why we can't really afford to mess around, and we can't afford to lose one, because there could be a very common illness that chimps have been able to fight off for their entire existence in that ecosystem because they have access to the tree or the clay or the termite soil or whatever it is. And if you remove that, then some basic illness that they've been able, or parasite that they've been able to fight off could be gone and we could lose them. So to me, it's a very time-sensitive issue. And also from a more human-centric perspective, it's also a time-sensitive issue in terms of ethical drug discovery because we're seeing global pandemics sweep across the world. We have antibacterial resistance. We have all of these new diseases popping up, and a lot of the treatments on the market are becoming not usable anymore because of antifungal resistance. It's a huge problem, and it will become more of a problem as we move forward. And so to be able to have access to compounds that are growing in forest pharmacies, again, if it's done ethically, could be hugely important for kind of fighting off and fending off these new diseases and pathogens coming our way. So,
and it kind of comes full circle because, like you mentioned, the pandemic, I kept hearing about how pandemics are on the rise as biodiversity decreases and how important biodiversity is for reducing the prevalence of these things. So yeah, like you need biodiversity also then to find these niche medicines that may be useful to certain species, and it's an ecosystem, it's so diverse and complex, and you have to maintain that biodiversity and
Exactly. It's one of these like frustratingly perfectly interlocked issues where you have pandemics coming at us and drug resistance coming at us, and you have potentially the cures, and then we're chopping down the cures right as the pandemic is hitting us, or these new pathogens are hitting us, and it's almost, we're looking at a perfect storm. But I mean, it's obviously not so easy to fix. It's very difficult to fix our biodiversity crisis, but you can really see, I think, in the case of self-medication, why leaving nature alone, letting nature proliferate and prosper is so important to not just the survival of people that live at the forest edge and animals that live in the forest, but also just everyone's global health. The health of our planet is so reliant on us just leaving these forests intact.
And I think that with research like yours and similar research, I think one of the most important outcomes is just educating people and like telling people about these amazing behaviors and phenomena that people living their everyday lives just wouldn't think about, right? And learning about it, like for us as well, is just so amazing. Like, wow, I can't believe this is all happening right now, and there's all this diversity, and to appreciate that as human beings is so important.
I think that's the crux of it, and I think that's what really hooked me. Like, it's so humbling to know that monarch butterflies are self-medicating on behalf of their offspring, and that animals, big and small and charismatic and non-charismatic, animals that we dismiss as, like slugs or, could be potentially unlocking these incredible mysteries that the natural world has plopped down for our potential discovery and our use if we are respectful and we keep the resources around long enough that we can learn about them. And when you have a relationship with the natural world that's one of respect and sustainability and stewardship, then you have access to all these incredible tools. But if you just blunder through your life on this planet and you chop down the forests and you get rid of all of these amazing natural spaces, we're losing the gifts that are already here. And I think that to me is the race against the clock. That's the mission, is find these amazing phenomenon, these natural compounds, these cases of animals doing cool things and knowing more than us about the natural world, because animals know way more than us about the natural world because they actually live in the natural world in a way that we don't anymore. Identifying and finding and highlighting and talking about those amazing skills that animals have, I think, at least for me, it brings me back to earth. That it reminds me, first of all, how much we have to learn from the animals around us and the plants around us and the ecosystems around us, and also just it drives me to kind of to keep doing the research, to keep talking about the research, and keep telling people how cool animals are and how amazingly intelligent and tuned into the gifts that the planet has to offer. So it gets me up every day. So, and that's after 3 years of a PhD. So I'm
incredible.
And there's a lot more that we don't know that's going to keep trickling out, and that's exciting too. It's an area of science that's very new relatively.
And it's wonderful to see how passionate and active you are about protecting the communities and making sure that all of this research is done responsibly and that we don't poach these forests.
Yeah, that's a perfect note to end on. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, it was really inspiring. It's not often I talk to an anthropologist, and it's enlightened a passion for the field that I didn't know I had within me. And I hope that this inspires many more researchers to go into the field and to care about the planet.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I hope you enjoyed the episode. Do share Neuroverse with your family and friends, and check us out on Instagram and Twitter at neuroverse_pod. I also highly recommend checking out Elodie's website, which is drelodiefreymann.com. And you can find so much more information on there, and also her amazing creative ventures to communicate her science and conservation efforts. Thank you for listening.